Conflicts of the 90s. During the 90s, we are going to see headlines across the nation with stories of just terrifying random acts of violence. And this is going to include things like in Waco, when federal agents raided a fortified compound of a cult after a 51-day siege. This raid actually triggered a fire, which was actually probably set from inside, and it killed about 80 people. We also get things like the Oklahoma City bombing of an office building, which would actually collapse the entire front of this 9-story building and killed 169 people. And then in 1999, you get the Columbine High School shooting. 2 students would go in and kill 12 of their classmates, a teacher, and then themselves. And in fact, schools in places like Arkansas and Oregon are going to experience similar terror from students wielding guns. These incidents in schools, but also in workplaces and schoolrooms and domestic shootings, all are going to invigorate efforts to monitor access to firearms. We're actually going to see like the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which set up a waiting period and background checks to purchase a firearm from a realtor, a pawn shop, a licensed firearm dealer, but that doesn't necessarily cover all the places that Americans can buy firearms. Americans did at this time debate about having some sort of restriction put forward against like certain types of weapons. Gun control is and was a highly debated topic. And a lot of this back in the 90s came down to people had drastically different ways of understanding the Second Amendment. If you read the entire Second Amendment, it talks about the formation of a militia as well as the right to bear arms. And so this becomes this question of the right to bear arms, is that an actual individual right, or is it really only in connection with like a citizen service militia? In 2008, we get the Supreme Court case of the District of Columbia v. Heller, and this is going to strike down DC's absolute ban on ownership or possession of handguns, and it is going to basically decide in this case that it is an individual's right to own and bear arms. And so that part of the debate has now ended. However, it's going to basically leave the state and federal firearm laws intact by allowing restriction of like individual categories of weapons and like regulation on acquisition of weapons and even use of a lot of these weapons that will fall short of prohibition, and it's mostly left in local and state hands, which is only problematic in that it turns out people can go across a border or leave their city and buy guns from other places. We're also going to see an increase on the war on drugs. Basically, during the 90s, we get things like the 3-strike measure. So this would be you get an increased penalty for an individual convicted of a third crime. Even if it was the same crime that they committed twice previously, third time, you're out, you get an increased penalty. This is going to mean explosive growth in the prison industry in the United States. In fact, we see funds having to be diverted from like education and healthcare just to staff prisons. A lot of this can be contributed to the war on drugs that's really pushing this prison boom that we see people found with like possession of like marijuana or something for the third time, and thus there we go. We're going to see anti-drug campaigns being pushed because of this. It's going to fall heavily on minorities. We're going to see things like laws being put in place where, oh, you can't sell drugs this close to a school. The thing is, typically the neighborhoods that are closer to schools tended to be minority neighborhoods, oftentimes because of socioeconomic issues. And so it meant that minorities, therefore, were more likely to end up going to jail, whereas, intravenous drug users that are middle and upper class white Americans aren't necessarily ever caught. That being said, as much as we're seeing a prison industry boom, actually crime fell pretty steadily after reaching a peak in the early 90s. This is actually going to be the same for violent crime as well. Which leads to the next debate over the death penalty. Starting in the 90s, we're seeing more and more used a new technique of DNA being used, and this is going to reveal that there were a lot of mistaken convictions. That, combined with the revelation of some incompetent defense attorneys, starts the debate over the death penalty anew. So we're going to see 38 of the 50 states of America will be willing to impose the death penalty, but actually 16 of those 38 states haven't carried one out since 1976. This is a huge topic of debate, especially in the 90s. People would talk about that like it was necessary, but then others pointed out issues like, well, the death penalty isn't actually a deterrent to murder, because oftentimes murder rates in states that had the death penalty actually were higher. So we see higher murder rates, so it's not deterring murder or anything. The other big issue that we see with this is that minorities often receive the death penalty far more often than white people with the same crimes. We see, though, in the 90s, groups like Catholics and specifically Catholic bishops and stuff coming out and condemning the death penalty. We are going to see the Supreme Court would come forward and they would forbade the execution of mentally handicapped people. And then later they would forbade the execution of anyone committing a crime while under the age of 18. As of 2018, this is actually more under the age of 21. But this is not necessarily according to the Supreme Court. As of 2018, it's more under the ABA, the American Bar Association, that it's very clear that attorneys basically know they would not be able to prosecute someone for to go be put to death for committing a crime and committing a murder, I should say, under the age of 21. And if you're going to talk about all the controversies and conflicts, you have to talk about Bill Clinton and his personal life, because it was hot news in the 90s. So Monica Lewinsky, a former White House intern, is going to admit to having a relationship with Bill Clinton. Well, Bill Clinton is going to deny it, and this basically ends up opening him up to charges of perjury and obstruction of justice. It also, I should mention, opens up the debate of what exactly is considered as having sex, because basically they had oral sex, and so there's an element of people go, oh, well, they didn't really have sex because it was oral sex, and yeah, there's that whole debate. Anyway, this affair does reveal that there are deep flaws in Clinton's character. It basically showed a lot of America that he was willing to shade the truth. But people are going to debate across the country if that type of flaw is that relevant or not to his ability to perform his constitutional duties as the President of the United States. Well, in the fall of 1998, Republicans in Congress are going to decide that his statements and his misstatements basically justified initiating a process of impeachment. This is clearly going to be a partisan vote. We're going to see the House approving of 2 charges and then forwarding them to the Senate. This began in really January of 1999. It ends in February. It is over very, very quickly, because basically moderate Republicans are going to join in Democrats to ensure that the Senate falls very much short of the 2/3 majority needed for conviction and thus removal from office. So what that really shows us, the entire impeachment, because you can say Bill Clinton was impeached, he just wasn't found guilty and thus removed from office. What it shows, the fact that he was impeached, it shows that people liked his politics, but felt like his personal flaws made him unfit to lead and represent the nation. The personal flaws being, that he lied about having extramarital affairs. So, thinking about all these controversies and horrors, which do you think has the largest impact on you today?